Hello everyone and welcome back to Social Movements. We are just coming off of our spring break, which is always fun. I hope you had a good one. I hope you had a relaxing one. I certainly did. In fact, it is Sunday evening, the night before we start school, and I am just now doing your video because even though I do that every week, I literally took off last week. One would think I would have gotten ahead of the game, but I did not. Anyway, I've got a new camera now, and I'm hoping it works better for me and for you, but we're going to find out because it does funky, weird things that I don't understand all the time. So I hope you'll bear with me as we, try out this new camera together. We are moving right through our book, and we're pretty much smack dab in the middle of it, as makes sense because we're smack dab in the middle of the semester. Chapter 7 is on sort of distinctions and definitions between a social movement organization and a social movement itself separate from an organization. And I always think about it in terms of this. An organization is much more structured, much more hierarchical a lot of the times, has very specific types of leadership than merely a movement, which means that the movement is sort of in flux. It's in a ground swelling state. It's not necessarily an organization as such. It's not seen as an organization so much as just sort of some grumblings or some undercurrent of some type. Some people might argue that a social movement organization starts out as a social movement in the beginning stages, the genesis of it, and sort of the organizational process takes time and goes through the stages of social movement development before it becomes an organization that can or cannot be terminated in one way or another. I disagree with that. Organizations are made up of people. Social movements are something that constitutes a people. So the difference that your book talks about is the difference between multiple persons versus the people. Remember in the beginning of the semester, I told you that social movements is about identity. It's about belonging to groups because it says something bigger than ourselves. It tells people about us, but helps us identify with bigger ideas, bigger concepts, and bigger actions than merely what we do as ourselves. In other words, some people might say, well, I'm a raging liberal. Well, are you also a card-carrying member of the ACLU? Now, this was always a sticking point for me because as liberal as I always felt myself to be, meaning that I wanted individual rights to be protected, there were certain things the ACLU would do that I just thought, nope, can't abide by that. So I can identify with the philosophy and the movement of the liberal, but I cannot identify with the organized group of the people of what most might call libertarianism, honestly, or liberalism as formed by the ACLU. So, do I think that they're beneficial? Sure. Do I want to identify as part of them? No, I don't. In other words, I don't want to constitute a part of that organization, even though I don't mind identifying with the movement. I hope I'm not muddying the waters a little bit here, but essentially, when I was in my living room with 6 or 7 other people talking about the fact that we were upset with book bans and book challenges and the school board doing what it was doing and everything else, despite all that, I believed that was the movement. We started garnering support. We got about 20 to 30 people involved. And it wasn't until we had over 50 people identifying with the movement that we became a 501c3. And people had to make a decision. Were they going to be a part of that group and identify as part of that group? Or were they just going to say, well, I like some of the things that they do, but I'm not a member of the group? So membership is very important because membership is synergistic. And this is sort of what Michael McGee was trying to get at when they cite him in there, rest his soul. He's been dead for a couple of decades, I think now. But he was alive when I was studying movements, and he was one of the top scholars that I studied. And when he talks about constituting the people, it's actually a very important distinction. When you have a group of people, you have the people, you have multiple persons, but you don't have an identity that you assign to them. More importantly, they may move as a group sometimes, but not always, but they're a group of individuals. When you constitute a people, when you put that together, what you're putting together is now an identity. There is no longer just a group of multiple persons. There is now a synergistic effect in how all of those people work together. So when McGee says you can't talk about them as just a group or as just an organization, because they are attempting to move something forward, he is making that distinction between an organization and a social movement organization, okay? The thought that you would organize does not necessarily mean you're no longer a movement either. For example, one of the biggest questions I had in my head was, if we become a 501c3, that means we're regulated by the government. We no longer have to pay taxes on certain things. Donations to us can be tax deductible and so on, which is great, except the one problem that we have with that is that I felt like that meant we were giving up the movement part, that we were giving up on the ideals because we were becoming a part of the system. If you think way back to the first couple chapters when we talked about defining a movement, one of the things I get caught up on is whether or not a movement has to be organized and uninstitutionalized. And if it becomes institutionalized, as we feel we have, then is it no longer a movement? And I think I said that I struggled with that a lot, especially when I was making that decision for my own movement. But the way that we constituted ourselves as not just a group of persons, but a people of U-turn in education, that was what made us a social movement organization, or what your book refers to as an SMO. Now, that term is actually relatively new. When I first started studying social movements, SMOs were not a thing. There were social movements and there were organizations, and never between the two shall meet. But now we understand that just because there's an organizational structure does not mean that a social movement is not a movement. It does not have to be chaos in order for it to be a social movement. And so this is why a lot of times people have a hard time when they talk about the civil rights movement generally, or if you talk about specifically Dr. Martin Luther King and say, well, he was the leader. He was certainly a visionary leader, but how groups got together in communities was completely disorganized. Still effective, but completely disorganized. There was no structure. When you put structure on top of that, does that mean it's no longer a movement? No. There are 4 examples in your book that I'm not going to read to you because I'm going to ask you a discussion question about them. And what I really want you to do when you read those is think, how is it that they constitute their people? The people from, I think it's like the John Birch Society we have, unless I'm mistaken, I think they're one of them. The Port Huron Statement, of the SDS, I think that Student Democratic Society, I don't remember what SDS stands for exactly, the Urban Guerrillas, and the Gray Panthers, okay? So those are all movements that your book talks about. I want you to be able to tell me what are some of the ways that they constitute themselves as people, not as just a group of multiple persons, okay? So once you've read through this idea of constituting, of what makes up an organization, what makes up a movement, then I want you to be able to apply it. And that's what we're going to be doing this week. So this next part is also new. It's a new addition to the book. The idea of looking at the rhetorical construction of an SMO. And it goes through 4 stages, right? It says that you invite, you define the identity for people, you structure your organization, and you relate it to others. Now, I could demonstrate this for you actually fairly easily, and I'm glad to be able to do it, because when we talk about studying social movements from a rhetorical perspective, it sometimes gets a little bit mushy. It's like, well, that's your opinion, really. I mean, how do we know what the organization is actually trying to do? How do we know what the movement is actually doing within itself? So when you have a movement that you started or that you belong to, and you're sort of on the, you're in the upper sort of echelons of the organization, and you're able to look into the movement a little bit better, these are easy questions to answer. At least you would hope so. So step 1, they talk about inviting. Now remember, these are how you understand from a rhetorical perspective the construction of a social movement organization. This is not about the success of said organization, or even necessarily about why it fails or what it should have done differently. But in some cases, I guess that we might find that. But this is, what did they do? Inviting people, step 1. Inviting not just persons, but inviting people who identify with your cause, with your mission. I'm in a group right now that's trying to form a caucus within one of the Missouri political parties, and it's a disaster because these people are so focused on organization that they're missing the identification point. That the first thing you need to do is to find individuals who would identify with your ideas, okay? And then you have to invite them in. You can't just throw it out there and say, we're going to do this. You have to build. It's funny because we always talk about this. I don't know how many of you would even know this movie anymore because the reference seems to have gone really out of vogue. But there's a great movie. It's called Field of Dreams. You might have heard of it. I don't know. Kevin Costner plays a baseball player who mows down his farm in the middle of Iowa and builds a baseball stadium. And it's very fantastical. I won't say baseball stadium, baseball field, okay? And there's some fantastical things that go along with that. And it's a really good film in a lot of ways. But we always said these things. One of the lines in the movie is, if you build it, they will come. And actually, I think it's actually, if you build it, he will come. But that's not here or there for the purposes of our discussion. If you build something, people will come to it, is a way of thinking about organizations. It's a way of thinking about what degrees a university should offer. It's a way of thinking about if you're going to have a party. You play in the party, then you invite people, and if nobody shows up, well, then nobody shows up, right? But this idea of, if you build it, they will come, doesn't work for a social movement. Instead, what you need is we need to get support. We need to have people identify with our purpose. We need to invite those who we know will identify with our purpose. And then we start to build it as they come in. Because a social movement is constituted by people who identify with it. Okay? I hope that makes sense to you. And I just lost my place on my notes. I apologize. For some reason, I went way too far. Okay, there we go. So the second step then is to define an identity as a people. So you've got people identifying with the mission, with the values, but now you need those people. You need those people to be constituted as a particular identity. We are members of U-Turn. That means that we wear our badges whenever we go to a school board meeting, or whenever we go to support our library boards, or whenever we go to a commissioner's meeting, because that means that I'm not just there, I'm there with my badge on, which means I'm carrying with me everything that goes along with being a member of U-Turn. So we become not just a group of persons, we become a people that are represented. I hope that makes sense. That's pretty simplistic. The step number 3 is structuring the organization. This is obviously very simple as well. You decide what kind of organization you're going to have, what type of leadership you want to have. A leader emerges, a leader is appointed, and a leader is elected, however way you go about doing that. But you structure the organization around achieving, or not just achieving goals, but around keeping everybody as part of the people, as keeping that identity together. Because if you lose the constitution of a movement's identity, then you lose the movement. Okay? And then finally, you relate that out to others. Not everybody is going to join the movement, but that doesn't mean that everybody does not agree with what you have to say, or that nobody agrees with what you have to say, or parts of your mission even, or things that you want to do as part of your mission. For example, we reach out to other groups and organizations that we believe have sort of similar ideas to what we have, and they might have similar goals. We've got a program out there, I can't remember what it's called, but it's in one of the grade schools in Springfield, and they provide a particular type of book exchange for children who are underprivileged. And we want to get involved with that. And so I talked to the person who runs it, and I just basically said, let us know, we'll give you some support. You don't need to do anything other than let us slap our name on there somewhere, because we want to be identified with you, and we want you to identify with us, because that makes us stronger. U-Turn in Education is also a member of a state organization. I happen to be on the steering committee for that somehow, some way. I got appointed to that, or voluntold, as I like to say. And that state committee gets together every organization that has some vested interest in DEI, in book banning, in obviously against it, who's for academic freedom and intellectual freedom, who believes in teaching the arts and the sciences, who believes we should keep religion out of public education, who believes public education is important, okay? All of those people, we get together, literacy councils and programs that teach people how to read. If they don't know how to read, how do we reach out to them? We get all these groups together under a coalition named Right to Read. Now, the Right to Read is in of itself a movement organization. It was built out of links to all these other organizations, and we are linked into another organization. It's a national one known as PEN America that has a Freedom to Read program that we are part of. This is what we call coalition building. And it starts with people wanting to be a part of a social movement. And then it builds all the way up. And so, you know, it's funny, people talk about, let's say, for example, Planned Parenthood, right? Did it start out as Planned Parenthood? Like all of a sudden it just appeared? No, that's not how it started out. It started out before, really, the undercurrents of it, the genesis of it occurred before Roe was even a question, okay? And then when Roe was passed, you know, the rights and the freedoms of people became okay to be public with that. And so smaller organizations started linking in sort of a coordinated, not a coordinated effort so much as sort of a chain, links in a chain that could help people with the things that they needed help with. And I know that we all think that it's just women, but it's not. And they took on the causes of not just abortion or premarital. Wow, I just brought religion right in there accidentally. Sorry about that. It wasn't just about abortion. It was about planning your family life. It was about choosing birth controls if you wanted to. It was about STD testing. They had all of those things, and they didn't all just appear because Planned Parenthood appeared. These groups started working together and coalesced into a larger and therefore more powerful, in a lot of ways, numbers wise at least, and lobbying wise and financially, into a bigger organization, or a bigger movement in this case. So social movement organizations take into account not just what a movement needs to do to help people's identity, but what an organization needs to do in order to keep people together as a people. So I hope that makes sense. Those distinctions are important because otherwise it's difficult to study a social movement if you only come from looking at it as a social movement and not looking at it as an organizing principle around which people come together and take action. So if you don't have some level of organization, if it's just chaos, you might say that's a movement, but it's not going anywhere. So it's important to acknowledge the type of organizational structures or practices that you need in order to make sure your social movement actually does something. I won't lie, it was a lot easier when we just talked about social movements in terms of chaos. There was just people just doing all sorts of different things. But that is not how it works. And that's certainly not how they're successful. Okay, so here's what's going to happen. I'm going to put up a discussion board question for you. As always, you have a week to do it, no rush. And that week doesn't start until tomorrow, which is Monday, because school doesn't come back until tomorrow, which is Monday. So I'll go ahead and put that up. And what I'm looking for is for you to tell me how each of the groups that you read about in your book constitute their people as a part of their mission, as their social movement organization. All right, everybody, short video today. I'm sure we're all grateful for that, and I will be seeing you soon.